That was fascinating. I remember those 8 balls. I used to love them. I always thought I was very lucky. I didn't know that they were skewed towards the positive. I like how nonsense clairvoyance and watered-down psychedelia are emerging in AI circles and how this impacts how companies mythologize themselves. All very cool. So now we're going to hear in person from Jake. Would you like to come up?
All right, let's put on some AI drag. There we go. All right, hello everyone. It's so great to be here in person and actually to be meeting some of you guys face to face, having really fascinating, wonderful conversations. So yeah, as you said earlier, we've got some work next door. Here, what you can see is my ZZ project. So this has been a project that I've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years. Thinking about the intersection of drag performance, drag queens, drag kings, drag things, drag monsters, kind of bringing queerness and gender fluidity into datasets which are often very normative. So this idea of queering the dataset. So this is a work from 2019 called Queering the Dataset. And you can see it's kind of constantly flowing between these different identities, between race, between gender, sort of the makeup taking over the face. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I kind of created some of these characters. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit, I think since we're here talking about critical boundaries, I'd like to talk about one of the concepts in AI that excited me most as an artist. And I'm coming completely from an artist background, but I've always wanted to tinker and hack with AI systems. I taught myself coding from a young age. So the first concept is this idea of a latent space. And I think there's some real poetry in kind of thinking about this thing spatially. So if we train a classifier network to recognize images of the human face, it will start to plot them in this map. And the limitations of that map are kind of what it has and hasn't learned and what it's represented and hasn't represented. But it is reducing everything to these vectors, to these coordinates. And I love this idea of, reducing things to maths. And then we can sort of remove the human classifications and labels, and you just kind of get left with this continuous space. So you can imagine, this is actually a multi-dimensional space. I'm kind of representing it here as a kind of 3-dimensional cluster. But you could imagine that, if you kind of move down to these dimensions, it might be all the images it's learnt of female faces, and then all the images it's learnt of black faces, of old faces, of young faces. And then there's this space in between that you can kind of constantly shift these dimensions around and move between. So the second idea is this idea of a generator, a GAN, a generative adversarial network. And if you take a coordinate in this latent space and say, okay, you've learned from this huge data set of 10 million images. It doesn't have to be images. That's the other thing. I love the fact that you could also, imagine the whole of the English language in this multidimensional space and kind of look at the biases and things that the networks learned through that. But if you take a particular point and say to it, try and generate me an image that could have been in the original data set, but that wasn't, and you pair it against the network that has learned from the original data set, but you say, now create me a new image somewhere in the middle. And maybe somewhere in the middle corresponds to, I don't know, a face of a white man in their 30s, which probably would be somewhere in the middle. So that's this idea of, we've got our recognition system, which becomes the discriminator up at the top, and then we have a generator that starts with random noise, and it will get better and better, improving itself to creating a realistic image of something that could have been in the original data set. Now, I love the language here as well, like the language that we're using, this idea of a discriminator. I think that's fascinating, like of parsing, of fakes and real images. And I think, again, that is something that's often talked about in queer language as well. So with trans people trying to parse, right? If this is a really normative, standardized data set and we're trying to create images that are parsing, and you've got like this discriminator, I know there's something quite interesting about the language we're choosing to use. I think also, obviously this idea of parsing is in the Turing test. And Turing being a gay man, I think it makes a lot of sense. They had come up with a test like that. So I think what I'd like to point out maybe is that, well, maybe also the word adversarial, that was something else we were just talking about, but in a way this is much more collaborative. I don't know quite why we're calling this like an adversarial process. They're kind of collaborating together to create something new, which I think's quite beautiful and quite poetic. So for quite a while now, my art has been kind of interested in investigating and pushing and disrupting these sorts of systems and looking at biases that exist in kind of standardized data sets and also creating my own data sets and kind of seeing what sort of things I can pull out of that to also create really, visually interesting work, but work which hopefully makes us think about these processes and try and, deconstruct and demystify them through looking at some of the visual outputs that they can create. I think I'd like to also point out that in a latent space, I think there's like an inherent queerness. and that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier, but this idea that you have all of these in-between spaces. You can constantly flow and morph between everything as learnt from maybe quite a standardized data set. So an example of this was actually a piece that I created back in 2016, which is called Machine Learning Porn. And it's basically a piece where I took Yahoo's algorithm for removing pornography from their search engines. There was a researcher in America, Gabriel Go, who kind of found that you could do this process. And they'd open source their algorithm for finding pornography. Now, if you paired that with a generative adversarial network and say, now create me, your image of the most pornographic porn, it creates something which isn't gendered. And I'm going to show you a picture. I've got a little explicit warning, but it's really not that explicit. So here are some images that it created. And actually, the final video piece, it was a video, and it was kind of constantly moving through this latent space of what it had learned. So these are some of the sorts of images that it was creating. And it went on a journey through this latent space of what it had learned from pornography. But the thing is that it's not gendered. That data set didn't contain labels of this is male genitalia, this is female genitalia. It was all just pornography. This is what you should be removing. And all of these images had something in common, which was these kind of fleshy genitalia blobs that it was trying to look for. So you kind of get this intersex visualization where it's unsupervised learning. There were no labels. There were no human classifications here. It was just given these images and said, what do these things have in common? And I love that because, it's creating these images of other and in-betweenness and queerness. So that was kind of inadvertently one of the first explorations of looking at that idea of queerness in latent spaces. So moving forwards to one of the more cutting-edge GANs that came out actually a few years ago now. They're even more realistic now, which was kind of the precursor, I guess, to deepfakes. Deepfakes being where you can start to actually control the movement of these faces. But these are generated in a way where it's just random points, vector coordinates in that latent space that correspond to these sorts of faces and these sorts of images. And as you can see, from this standardized data set that it was trained on, which was 70,000 images gathered from Flickr, it's quite normative. It tends to be more white, more male, but definitely doesn't really recognize images of queerness, of otherness, of transness. So what I wanted to do was to take this data set and disrupt it by injecting 1,000 images of drag kings, drag queens, drag things. And it only took 1,000 images from the original 40,000, and we moved from this to this. So those are the same points in that space. You can see it again. So that's the querying of the data set. And it moves into this kind of expressive otherness. I guess it's kind of beckoning the question. I don't have the answers to any of these questions, but I want to open up this space, like whether we do want to be recognized or represented by these algorithms. Are we here, dirtying the data set, sort of breaking down, it's no longer able to fulfill its original function of creating kind of hyper-realistic human faces. It's starting to create something a bit weird and other. And maybe that's broken, the function of that system. So is that a sort of dirtying and querying? Or, do we want to be represented? I think there was an interesting study, Morgan Klaus Schurman in America looking at trans people being misgendered when they walk down the street, and this constant dysmorphia that you can get from, not being recognized by these systems. But then obviously it comes, with who is looking at these people, who's putting us in different categories. And I think, it's just, and then also what Zach Blass was doing earlier, which is like obfuscation. So, the whole thing of kind of creating jewelry to not be recognized by these systems and stand outside of them. So this is a video of moving through this latent space of everything that it had kind of been, the network has shifted, all the weights have shifted into this queer space from this space of heteronormativity, and this is it moving through, and as you can see, it's able to constantly drift between identities. So this was my kind of original ZZ, if you like. ZZ, the name, by the way, is the name of my sort of drag character. And it comes from the Z vector, which is how you interface with AI and kind of control these latent embeddings, and the Z pronoun, the non-binary gender pronoun. It's also French for Willy, which I find quite fun. So moving on from here, what I really wanted to do was to think about how I could bring my friends in the London drag scene into this whole process. How can we actually empower our community to, and start to use it actually as a performance tool? I wanted to think about how can we kind of bring this thing to stage? How can, my friends as drag performers be collaborating with artificial intelligence? So what we did was through lockdown, started to create deepfake models of a lot of real-life drag kings and drag queens, some of the UK's top drag performers, and we basically created models of each of their bodies, and that involved going to a queer venue that was shut down because of COVID, and filming them in a room, and basically filming them from every angle. So that's our data set, is kind of a few minutes of them moving around. And once we've got that, we can do skeleton tracking. That becomes our data set. So that's Lily Snatchdragon, who's an amazing award-winning drag performer. And you can see, so here is the process of a conditional GAN, a deep fake, being created, where the original images are up on the top left, and then we've got the skeletons, and then it's trying to, the machine learning process can only see the skeletons, and it's trying to get as close as possible to the original image, and it's given a score to do that. So it's, arranging the pixels to try and create those original images. Once you've got that kind of model baked of what Lily looks like from every angle, and it's not going to be what Lily looks like from every angle, and that's something that I really love, is that some of our drag performers, you never saw them from the back, or you never saw them doing something, and then that is, again, the limitation of that model. But once you've got this kind of deepfake model, we can then start to control Lily's body, which sounds like a kind of really quite dark, sinister thing, which it is. And deepfakes are quite dark and sinister. And generally they are used to control politicians' faces, or even more scarily, by governments to oppress and control citizens. And I think, this idea of how can we empower ourselves to do this in a consensual way. Everyone involved in this project, anyone that was going to be controlling Lily's body was a friend of Lily in the first place, and that was a really important part of this process. We also paid all of our performers, which, data sets aren't normally paid for. So you can see here's kind of Lily getting better and better. And here is another drag performer controlling Lily's movement. So that's one of our deepfake drag performers. So we did this whole process with 13 different performers. And as I say, it's, the consent was so important to keep this a closed system, to make sure that everyone knew everybody else who was working within this. And I think, in a way, it's, one of the first, I think, deepfake projects to be thinking about this as a kind of performance collaboration tool, but also to think about how we can, celebrate and lift ourselves up using these kind of fairly dark technologies rather than to further oppress marginalized communities. So And I guess also it's this idea of, constructing on top of a construction. Obviously, drag is a construction itself. We are constructing a character of a hyper version of gender. And Lily Snatchdragon's actually a female drag performer, but she creates an elevated idea of femininity in her drag performance. So kind of to take that construction, then construct a deepfake on top of it on our kind of virtual cabaret stage. And then the idea of this project is also to try and deconstruct it. So that's why I want to do talks like this, is to actually show the processes, try and demystify this. And I think a lot of art using AI intentionally mystifies these processes, which really frustrates me, because I think as artists it's really important that we can try and explain and unravel and remove some of the fear going on around these systems to try and as honestly as we can, as artists, not engineers, kind of try and give an honest impression of how these processes work. So moving on from there, what we had is, yes, we had our 13 models of drag performers, and they're all able to control each other's movements and each other's bodies, and you can actually go and play with this online. I'll give you the link in a second. But we also created an additional model, which was all 13 of them amalgamated into one. And this was wonderful, because when I showed the drag performers this, they were kind of amazed because they saw bits of themselves in each of these, but none of these characters exist. They're kind of, in between all of the different performers that we worked with. So unfortunately, I'm not allowed to play sound from this video. This was going to be, it's actually David Bowie, 5 years. Performed by a drag performer called Ruby Wednesday. But you can see here what happens when this kind of amalgamation performer performs to you. It's kind of constantly flicking and changing between. So I think you can see Mark Anthony, amazing drag king there, a bit of Ruby Wednesday, Chio coming in, and kind of this flipping between Lily Snatchdragon. But you can go and listen to this online. I would recommend it, because actually seeing them perform with music is what really animates it and makes it feel so special and celebratory. So you can go on the website, zz.ai. It was actually funded by the Edinburgh Futures Institute, so a department called Experiential AI, Drew Hemmant, who supported this project. And now it's showing in a bunch of museums in Germany and in China. It's going to be coming to the V&A soon, which is really exciting. So in 2023, come and visit us at the V&A, and we'll have quite a large room for a durational exhibition. So lastly, because I wasn't able to play any sound in that last one, which was a bit of a disappointment, I'm going to play you another piece, an older piece of mine, but does have sound that I'm allowed to play. And it's a piece called Data from 2016. And I guess it's thinking a little bit more about the politics of who has the power, and basically it's using a machine learning algorithm to analyze the speeches of the most influential and powerful people in tech to basically remove everything they said that wasn't a number. So I'm going to play a little bit of that. Here we go. Oh, is it playing? Oh no. Maybe it's not able to play.
200,000, 100,000, 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, 100, 100 million, 100, 100, 110 million, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 4, 5, 3, 5, 5, 5, 6, 5, 5, 5, 4, 5, 4, 1, 6, 6, 7, 7, 7, 8, 8, 9, 9, 5,000.
1 billion, 130 million, 100 million, 2 billion, 1, 200.
250, 71.
10,000, 150, 10,000, 18,000, 10.
16.
16.
Tube 350, 20,
2,
20, 350, 50.
10, 15,
9,000.
9,000,
1 6 billion, 100 million, 100 million, 100 million, 600, 100 million, 1 10
billion,
5 30 million, 1 3 2 27 million to 100.
1 530,000 0 1 10,000 10,000 3 or 400 million 1 trillion
380 to 350,000
4 20
10 1 3 trillion 17 400 trillions 5 millions 1 tens thousands millions 500 billion 15 4 6 trillion 2 million 5,000 50 billion 64 55
1 billion 80 40 10 0 3
400 million 4 billion
1 4 billion 1980s 1 4 billion 1980s 300 million 10 15 billion
13,000 1,500 1,525 million 1 billion 2 billion 7 billion 4 billion 185 10 10
400 million 24 45
1 10 5 5 5 500 billion 200 1,500 1,000 100
1 2
Mark. You can watch an extended version online on my website. So, okay, thank you so much.
That was phenomenal. Thank you so much. That's sometimes what I actually hear when I listen to them speak, so that's very nice. It reminded me, there's a great book by Jennifer Marie Brissett, the science fiction writer, where the last days of Earth are recorded on a glitching computer program, and because it glitches and it's replete with error codes, characters slip and slide into each other, and it's all very queer and great. So we've now got a short Q&A with Jake. And while you'll think of some questions, I've got a question from someone online about whether you think that outside of the artistic sphere, there is a future for genuinely consensual big data and deep fakes. Big question.
Oh, big question. Very big question. I like to think so. I like to be an optimist and be hopeful for where this is all going. I think, yeah, I'd have to think about it. I guess as an artist, my system, it's a much more closed system. We're creating small data sets for ourselves. I think as soon as it becomes a much larger universal question, kind of getting the ultimate data set, I think it's going to be really difficult for that. And I think that will be a really tricky problem that we're going to have to tackle together. But perhaps it's the wrong question, thinking about sort of a much larger overall universal system, actually thinking about smaller systems that we can make as communities, and we can it can be consensual within our smaller systems could be an interesting way forwards. But yeah, so I'm not sure if that really answers that.
No, it does. It definitely does. Data's difficult. It's a difficult problem to solve. We have a question over here.
Hi, this was fabulous. Thank you. And especially because usually we see deepfake presented as such a scary thing, and seeing it, the sort of liberatory potential is really fascinating. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the talk we heard earlier today by Michelle Alam about how AI very often sort of takes away the ambiguity of gender, of race, and sort of locks us into certain categories, which is sort of actually the opposite of what you're doing here. And I'm just sort of trying to wrap my head around how most forms of AI do or maybe it's just that it's run by corporations and it's run by people wanting to profile people for ads or to stop migrants from entering a country or something like that, whereas your goal is sort of the opposite of that. And I'm just wondering, is this something to do with deep fakes, do you think? And has it to do with the technologies you're using, or is it, as you said, that it's community driven and sort of with a specific goal?
Yeah, I think both. I think, I'm looking for it. I'm seeking it out. And I think, the overarching narrative is that, yes, there is a huge amount of discrimination, giving it binary classifications, the way that we label data sets, the way that we're trying to look to read them. I think, me as an artist, I'm maybe looking for alternate narratives in that and other ways of reading that, and sort of posing the question, can latent spaces be queer if we kind of remove the labels and the classifications that we're both putting in and reading out of it? And of course, it's still inheriting values and inheriting biases, but I think there is something beautiful in sort of how we can reduce these things to just numbers and actually strip out a lot of the identities and terms and labels and binaries that we have kind of been feeding into them. So that's kind of something that I was really interested in. Those sorts of networks where you're building up those latent spaces, generally the function or purpose is to then get the labels back out. But in a way, I've kind of intervened a stage before that when it's still really quite fluid. And I would argue, yes, it has this kind of queerness or ambiguity where it's just reducing things to mathematical dimensions. I think, deep fakes are different because that's kind of a specific application as well. And I'm kind of trying to think of a way of using that to, empower and kind of remove, again, some of those binaries and issues that are often written into those things. But yeah, yeah, I think they are often used in quite sinister, insidious ways. And I also think that it's an interesting one that, it's not always visible, the coding. And I'm looking at facial recognition systems or facial data sets where you can see race quite easily, and you can, maybe queerness is a more complicated one. But I also think like class, for instance, is actually a very difficult one often to sort of pull those biases out, but in many ways even more insidious. So I'd be interested to see other artists maybe as well trying to sort of question data set politics when it comes to ableism and class and so many of these other things that are often not really discussed or thought about as much when it comes to the data sets.
And I think we have another question from Alan.
Hey, Alan.
Thank you so much. Lovely to hear this elaborated further and after seeing the great work. And I'd just like to draw the connections that we've already discussed between us, Jake, between your work and our nowhere near so accomplished panel yesterday, but I think really interesting to explore through these two very different media what of course is exactly the same mechanism at a certain level of abstraction. And I think by speaking across these different media forms of the performativity of an academic text and the performativity of genderqueered drag, at a level of abstraction, both involve mathematical latent spaces, and both obviously also involve this messing with identity. And so there's just a couple of things that I'd like to probe further on, thinking about our experiences as the performers in yesterday's queer identity, in which we assumed each other's personas for a brief moment of academic drag. One of the things that we felt was this feeling of ownership about the part of the latent space that clearly had acquired our own voice. And we actually became quite protective. And it was as we'd become a kind of, well, not a cyborg, but an extended body in a sense that, and so we became offended when pieces of, me, even though it was never me, but, my ghost, got deleted because the presentation was too long. But hang on, that's me. That's not at all. So there's that question of identity, and I'm interested to know the extent to which your performers who provided the training material for in your case, might have also experienced this extension of their bodies into the mathematical space. That's one question. And then the second question is relating to our kind of motivating theme of plagiarism. And of course, although we didn't discuss it yesterday, terrible capacity for plagiarism in the future, and I think we can all imagine what it's going to be like once our students start reprocessing our own words in undetectable ways and reflecting back to us in ways that we suspect they already do already, but will be very disturbing when they just had to press a button to do it. There's that plagiaristic question, which is of course a moral issue, and you've very much avoided that by paying your performers, making sure they're identified and acknowledged for their talents. But there's the more problematic question of self-plagiarism, which is almost, it's an oxymoronic phrase, you might say, because, in the traditional thinking of plagiarism, how could you plagiarize yourself? But this is a common phrase in computer science conferences where it's used as a sort of ethical obligation of people to be efficient users of the academic communication channel, and there's now the suggestion that it's an immoral act, and in fact you can be censured quite heavily for presenting a paper which is considered to be too similar to your previous paper, and you can actually be thrown out of a conference for self-plagiarism because your new ideas are not original enough compared to what you said before. So that's the second question really is, do you think, even though you've done everything you can to avoid the misattribution, do your performers feel that they might be becoming compromised as having these kind of entities that are plagiarizing their own performance under their own name?
I hope not. We got them all to, there's also, they can withdraw at any point if they feel uncomfortable. And I think that's an important thing as well. We kind of went through the ethical procedure of this. I think to, answer your first question, this is actually, it is something that we've been exploring a bit. So there's kind of another project which is coming out of this CZ project. So you can see the 13 drag performers, and they're all performing in each other's body. But my main collaborator, who is called Me, the Drag Queen, which is a wonderfully confusing name, we've actually been creating a deepfake version of her that she can perform live alongside her kind of deepfake doppelganger clone. And that's really fun because I think she does feel, a lot of pride or, I guess in a way, none of the drag performers are really overly anthropomorphizing these things. I think they are thinking of them very much as themselves and them creating the datasets. And the fact that they created the dataset for the looks, but they also created the datasets for the movements. So I don't think they're really thinking of it in that way, maybe as much as when you're using kind of text generation and you kind of become a bit protective of something completely generated. But it's really, diverting quite a lot from the original source material. I think for us, I think they are seeing it as a direct process that they have kind of been involved in at every stage. But we're still having a lot of fun with that narrative. So with Zizi and me, this kind of deep fake duet between the AI clone and the real original drag performer, we are really pushing those narratives. So they perform anything you can do, I can do better. We're kind of thinking about, ideas of society, of kind of cliches around AI and society and trying to kind of really satire those in a really tongue-in-cheek drag way. But yeah, I think she definitely feels a lot of affection towards her. And she always says that's what she's always wanted to do as a drag performer, is perform with herself, which she is literally doing. We're having a lot of fun with that, and hopefully we'll take it stage at some point as well. But yeah, I don't see them as extensions of. I mean, they're also extensions of myself. It's an interesting one. I know what you mean about the kind of, you do start to build some sort of attachment or feel kind of possessive of them. But yeah, the IP questions as well. I mean, there's so much to talk about there, and the ownership of the data. But yeah, we've tried to do this kind of one as consensually as we could. But of course, yeah, also in terms of creating artwork, when you're talking about self-plagiarism in academic papers, I think I'm feeling that a bit as an artist. Like, one of these GANs that I've trained on my own custom datasets, I can theoretically generate infinite video out of. And how do I kind of square that with institutions and, sort of traditional ideas of collection in art and those sorts of questions? Because, where's the rarity or scarcity if I can generate this thing infinitely with no additional labor, really? So yeah, there's a lot of interesting questions to think through when it comes to art and using machine learning.
That's brilliant, and I love that drag is kind of the perfect place where you can dramatize that competitive spirit between humans and AI.
And so many good musical theatre duets as well, which is all about that competition.
I'd love to see more. We have another question over here from Stephen.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jacob. I mean, all three works and talks are fantastic. And I've just been thinking a bit about Jill's question. We've seen so much in the last couple of days about how this technology is used to box people in. And here you are doing fantastic liberatory things. And how can that be? I suppose it shows that it's not intrinsic to the technology, that, the boxing in and the categorization, it's intrinsic to the purpose, rather, for which it's being used. And so much of what we worry about in the use of AI and data-driven technologies is this further bureaucratization of life, that these technologies are being used to manage and control at scale ever more efficiently and ever more inhumanly. And for that, they need these categories. And so this fear we have, it's the fear of the machine identifying us as a terrorist in the airport, the machine saying, no, you can't have a mortgage, and so on, because we've just been put in the wrong box. And I was asking myself as I was watching these works, what is liberatory about them? I mean, they alternate between being witty and provocative and beautiful and lots of other things. But why are they liberatory? And is it perhaps because they're so anti-bureaucratic? Is it exactly because they're throwing off these boxes which the world wants to put us in?
No, well, that feels like a big compliment. I think, yeah, hopefully. I mean, I think that's a queer tactic as well, though, is to take these, systems created by, systems of power to oppress us and kind of sprinkle them with glitter and kind of find ways of, hacking them and getting them to do something they were not intended to do, kind of stripping out the function or, it's kind of purposeless as well. And, of course, AI isn't going to take over from drag, but it's kind of a fun thing to pose. And it is, I think it is this sort of, hopefully, liberation space. But I don't want to kind of undermine like the serious issues as well, and that's kind of what I hope that through doing something so joyous and celebratory and hopefully accessible, I think that's the other thing, is that a lot of these areas aren't very accessible. Like AI and fine art are not accessible spaces really, but drag is. It's a popular performance form which everyone really wants to engage with. So to kind of use that to talk about these really quite serious issues, but in a really fun, joyous, celebratory way, I'm sort of hoping that maybe some people can have conversations about some of the darker side and things that are present in these systems. But I don't have to necessarily make art explicitly about those as well. We can have fun with it.
And as the last question, I might be cheeky and ask one myself, which is, can you speak more to kind of the experience of some of the performers that you worked with, how they felt about it, what their reaction was? Because watching Rashad's video, the dancers seemed really emotional at the end.
Right, yeah. Yeah, we had a lot of fun with that. So I guess, firstly, the first piece that I created, Querying the Dataset, it was really interesting to see their response in the fact that they were reading in faces. And obviously these are all, generated faces that don't exist. But again, maybe sort of relating to what Alan was saying, sort of feeling some possession, or you want to read into what you're seeing, and they were all saying, like, that looks like this drag performer, and that looks like my friends and my other friends, and I found that really fascinating. And of course, my original data set of 1,000 performers, there might have been some of those performers in it, but I still found it really interesting to sort of see how they were reading kind of the encodings. And yeah, I think they enjoyed that a lot. But I think the funnest thing in a way was the failure. And I think for the performers as well. So kind of think about this as a performance tool. And there's, it's the whole queer art of failure that's been written about a fair amount. And it shows the limitations of these models in the sense that, we had Caramel, who's an amazing dancer, also doing Vogue and doing Beyonce. And at one moment they dropped into the splits, right? But the thing is that all of the models of all the other drag performers that we had, it had never seen them do the splits. So in the video, it does not know what to do. It just completely glitches and freaks out. And suddenly you kind of get this puddle on the floor where kind of, their gown dissolves and their wig flies off in a sort of candy floss balloon. And like it's those sorts of moments that I think the drag performers had so much fun in. And I think in a way that is where the art is as well, because those, for me, sort of seeing those artifacts of how limited these systems can be, that is kind of where the expression comes from, and those are the things that we definitely attach to as artists, and I think that's why it's really fun to use this as a performance tool. So I mean, if it was creating a perfectly realistic, identical version of each of our performers, that wouldn't be so interesting, and in a way it's the fact that this technology is still somewhat in its infancy that we're able to kind of create this thing now when it's, not perfect. And that's what we're trying to pull out and look at. And I guess, those failures also allow us to demystify it and to sort of see behind the black box of how this thing is actually working, or the process at play. So. Yeah,
and I think it's really important that people know more about those failures almost, and some of the best kind of popular fiction works or books I've read on AI that highlight the failures of certain systems, what they can and can't do, I think is really important for the public to know more about. So it's a real treat to have you here. And another round of applause, please. And also, if you're at home, for Rashad and Zach. So tomorrow we begin again at 9:30. And now, let's go look at some art. This way. Thanks a lot.